My guest today is Mary Hirschfeld, Associate Professor of Economics and Theology at Villanova University. Mary has a PhD in economics from Harvard University and a PhD in theology from Notre Dame. Her book, Aquinas and the Market Towards a Humane Economy, is the book we as a society, I think, need someone with this background to write. It's profound and it's fascinating work, and I'm really excited to discuss it today. Mary, welcome to the show.
Hi, it's great to be here.
So going into this little project for myself, my impression of Christian economic thought is it actually feels pretty socialist. There's a lot of emphasis on altruism and pleading or instructing people to act with certain higher motivations. Aquinas, surprisingly to me, seems to share more common ground with economists, actually, than I was expecting. And I'm wondering, first, you can feel free to dispute my premise there, but where does Aquinas agree with mainstream economic thinking today?
Okay, so just to go to your premise, in the main, I can definitely see how you would get that impression. It's very often the impression that I get that a lot of Christian theologians thinking about economics do so from kind of a, yeah, let's all be nice, let's love each other and pursue the
Yeah.
common good and all of that. The Catholic tradition out of which I'm writing prides itself on finding a third path between socialism on the one hand and capitalism on the other. So it doesn't sound as socialist, at least in its depths of the teaching. It's not as socialist as a lot of Christian ethicists can sound, although people can take it that way, clearly. So anyway, so your impression is sort of right, mostly right. The reason that I gravitated towards Aquinas for this project is exactly because for me as an economist coming into theology, I was alarmed by the failure to understand the value of markets and private property or so on. And I loved Aquinas independently for his theological heft. But in pursuing a project on Aquinas on private property, I realized he had exactly the right tools. He has space for understanding the value of markets. He positively affirms private property as part of the good life. So that gives points of contact between Aquinas and economists. And yet he does so in a different framework, which allows room for some of the critiques that the theologians are trying to get at. So it allows you to bring in those critiques, but in a way that is more aware of and responsive to the values of markets. So that's the heart of the book, and that's why I love Aquinas.
How much how much of, I guess, economic values, we can come to that again, of course, did he anticipate? Did he actually, explicitly endorse or even, I guess, implicitly endorse? What was this exact signal you picked up on? In the book, you talk a bit about private property being an important piece. And I'm wondering kind of how closely did it map in the actual texts?
Okay, so first of all, to be completely fair or clear, Aquinas is writing centuries before Adam Smith. He does not
Right.
know about unintended consequences.
Yeah.
He doesn't know that markets guide us towards relatively efficient outcomes or anything like that. But what happens in his defense of private property is he gives space for a lot of the intuitions that economists are going to develop later on, even though he himself doesn't do that. So he defends his teaching on private property is more complicated than what I'm about to say, but his narrow defense on why private property is licit in his terminology, why it's legal or permissible or maybe even downright good, is for three reasons. And this all has to do with our ability to manage property well in order to, generate a living out of it. So one is if we didn't have private property, we would all quarrel and fight with each other about who gets what. So
Right.
that's an affirmation that would work if we were fallen, but if we were all saints, then we would need private property. And that was the classic Christian position, which is in a fallen world, we're too crappy to have communal property, so we need to have private property. But the other two reasons are more ambiguous. The second one, and this is the one that dovetails with economics, I think, very well, is if we didn't have private property, we would just be disorganized. We wouldn't know who was supposed to do what or who was supposed to take care of what. So we could all have goodwill and get up in the morning and go out to say we're going to go work for the common good. But, who takes care of the rhubarbs? Who takes care of the radishes? Who's supposed to go water the orange trees? Like, it's just not clear. So private property has the great virtue of allowing us to know what is our responsibility to take care of. And in that argument, I find plenty of room for the idea of specialization. Um, it respects it respects our finitude. It says something about, I can take care of this plot of ground if it's mine. I know what crops grow best on it. I know what fertilizers work best on it. It just gives all sorts of room for that. And of course, then we're going to want to have this facility to trade, and that's where markets would come in. So that's the space where I see lots of room for the engagement with economics. And then the third one is the more is the interesting one. He says the third reason why we want to have private property is because we're more likely to work hard if we're procuring goods for ourselves, something like that. And so as an economist, I'm like, okay, ding, ding, ding. He's got an idea about incentives. But that's also the place where his thought diverges from economists, because the next thing he's going to say is, okay, private property is good for these three reasons. We really need to have it. It's actively good. But once we've divided the world with private property, we should hold that private property as though it were in common, to wit, by being willing to share the goods with others. And so I had this big, huge wrestling match in my head going, how does that square with that third reason for why private property is good? How is it that private property incentivizes me to actually work hard, but then I'm supposed to turn around and give it all away, right? How does that work? And that's what led me to the insight about the way Aquinas differs from economists. And that is, he thinks self-interest is perfectly good and proper. It's actually right for me to want to feed myself and my family first. And that's why private property channels properly my concern for myself into productive activity. But he has this idea that what I really want, if I really thought hard about it, what I want economically is bounded. That is, I want to work hard so that I can feed myself, shelter myself, or so on, but that I have a fixed idea about what I need, such that if I had a bumper crop, I would meet all my needs, feed my family, maybe even take care of some friends and neighbors. But whatever was surplus to that, whatever was beyond that, that's what would be available to share to others freely in their need. So he has an idea about self-interest, but unlike ours, it's a self-interest that does not cash out as I want as much as I can get. It's I want as much as I need is the difference.
How and we'll come back to that because that's an incredibly important point. We'll come back to that probably from more than one direction. But I'm wondering how widely accepted this is, because you make some points about how he's a very influential theologian and maybe influential in other way philosopher as well. And is this mainstream Catholic thought, what you're saying there, or does he diverge in any kind of way from the thinking as it stands today in the Catholic Church?
He's a doctor of the church. So Aquinas is the single most important theologian in the Catholic Church. He's by no means the only one.
Right.
But you can sort of play him as a trump card.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Funny.
I mean, people are going to disagree or whatever, but if you say, if you say I'm following Aquinas, then people have to take you seriously. And the church itself, when the economy started to go towards the capitalist market order, the church belatedly around 1892, I'm going to get the exact date wrong, started putting out encyclicals to respond to this new economic order. And the first thing they took up was private property. And the defense there mostly follows Aquinas, although interestingly, it's got a little bit of John Locke in there also. But the church comes down as saying private property is important, among other things, because it allows individuals to maintain their own dignity. So I think the idea in the church is widespread property ownership so that everybody has enough of a stake to be able to take care of themselves.
Another question about just his status. Is the source of his influence, is it this line of thinking, or is he a superstar in some theological topic or several, and then this kind of comes along, or so where's the source of his influence? Like, what was his real innovation or contribution? Was it this or something else?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. He's a superstar, and the source of his influence is his Summa Theologica, this monumental work covering all of theology. It integrates philosophy and faith really systematically, deeply, and profoundly. So Aquinas is here. Aquinas' hero in the philosophical world is Aristotle. And Aristotle was coming into the European world in Latin translation in the 13th century when Aquinas lived. And the medievals just loved Aristotle, or a lot of them did. And so, but the question was, how do you integrate this strong philosophical approach to things with faith, with revelation? And Aquinas, obviously loves revelation also. So he's just got this passionate love for both, and he integrates them and shows how they fit together and actually support each other. And that's just foundational to the Catholic approach. So as recently as John Paul II, in his Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason, he talks about philosophy and theology as being two wings that need to fly together. And that's Aquinas' project. So.
And one other thought that I had just in your explanation there was, in the book you have an interesting way of dividing up the different ways in which theology can influence economics. And I'd like to talk about those, because it seems to me that one could probably take Aquinas' thought and then pick any one of these strategies, right? And use that to pursue it. But you adopt a very specific way of approaching this problem. And I wonder if you could talk about that for a sec.
And I do think I get that from Aquinas.
Okay.
So the question is, we have two disciplines. We have economics on the one hand and theology on the other, and we want to bring them into engagement. So on what basis would we do that? And the question is, which of the disciplines has more weight? Or do they come in as equals? And if they come in as equals, what do we do when they have disparate propositions? How do we reconcile them? So strategy number one would be to say, well, economics is an actual science, so it's the one that has more weight. And so then the economic or the theological project would be to say, given that economists have told us how markets work, how does that help us understand what the gospel is saying about economic life? And some do that sympathetically, saying, we can find a theological basis for the freedom that's inherent in markets, something like that. So you can get a market-friendly theological reading. Others take the opposite approach. They're like, well, mainstream economics is too greedy or whatever, so they instead plant themselves on a more Marxist kind of economic basis, and then find theological resonance with the Marxist theology, Marxist economic approach. But in both cases, theology is being made to conform to whatever is the basic way of seeing the world that comes from the economics.
Right.
And from my point of view, it's just not very helpful. I mean, why not just have the economists fight the Marxists? Because what ends up happening is you have the economic debates within mainstream economics and between mainstream economics and Marxism. And then you have basically a bunch of theologians picking aspects of theology to cheerlead for the side that they are rooting for, right?
Right.
So anyway, the second approach, which is really quite common, and a lot of economists want to gravitate it towards it also, is to say, well, now we're coming into mainstream economics. Economics is instrumental. It's about trying to figure out how to achieve good policies. So if a policymaker says, I want to give, cheaper housing to the poor, then economists can do their analysis and say, well, it might look like rent control would be a good way to do that, but here's some better ideas about how to achieve that goal that you've laid out. And if that's your picture of what economics is doing, then there's clearly a role for a theologian or an ethicist to say what it is that we should be aiming at. So economists do the positive analysis about what various policies would do in terms of achieving various goals. And then normative the normative side about what those goals should be comes from the theologians or the ethicists. So, and that's not bad. But my concern about it was sort of more in the weeds, and I don't know how far you want to go into it. The way it plays out is it's not clear what the theologians or the ethicists are actually contributing, because a lot of what happens is people think that these debates about, say, minimum wage, or debates about whether we should want to help the working poor or should not want to help the working poor. Whereas, in fact, in economics, the debate isn't whether we should or should not help the working poor. It's about how best to help the working poor.
Mm-hmm.
So, what does a theologian really have to contribute? If everybody agrees that the purpose of economics is to try to help the working poor, then what does the theologian add when they say, oh, and theologically speaking, it would be good for you to help the working poor? It just doesn't add much. And there's a strange kind of energy in the literature because theologians are not falling all over themselves to say, medicine should find a cure for cancer.
Right.
So, yeah, and there's more to be said about that. But it looks like it's a fruitful division of labor, but it really isn't because there's actually already a consensus, I think.
Yeah, on the goals. And I think that, one of the things that I thought was fascinating, and you can dig in deeper if you'd like on this, is the way in which that fails is interesting. If you're using the tools of economics, those themselves is where kind of the taint is, right? But the rational choice model and the like. But we could come back to that if you like, or however you want to continue the narrative.
Yeah, let's come back to that. So So then the third one is to say let's go ahead and suck it up and let theology be the dominant discourse. And from a theological point of view, it should be, since theology is about ordering your life towards your ultimate ends, which is God, and theology is the discipline that does that. You should start with theology. But this would be mostly about saying what we're going to do is use a theological orientation towards what is actually good, what is actually human happiness, how do we really understand that? And then, given that orientation, you would still have the discipline of economics doing its own economic thing, because the economists roll up their sleeves and go and look at the world as it is and figure out what's going on.
Yep.
And then what you would want to do is engage in an integration that says, what can we learn from economists about how the world actually is? We might want to correct a few things in economics, because economists, although they do a good job of describing how the world is, or at least that's what their enterprise is, and they're reasonably good at it, I think. They often slide into prescribing, telling us how the world should be, and in ways that are incompatible with the theological vision. So the way I approach it is, I'm going to stick to my guns about how I think the world should be ordered. But on Aquinas' view, you can't just stop with how the world should be ordered. You have to pay attention to how people in the actual world behave. We think we live in a fallen world, so we would expect people to not behave in a way that necessarily moves them towards genuine happiness. So let's learn from the economists about how that plays out. And then there's this lovely space where, given the world as it is, how do we think about policies, institutions, and norms and so on that respects the limitations of human behavior, but doesn't reify it and make us think that that's the only way we can be, that leaves space for us to move towards a better way of engaging with our economic lives.
Do you want to talk about the Machiavellian Critique? That might be useful, because it strikes me as being really powerful way to shoot down a lot of ideas that that seek to have the right motivation, right? So you want to try and improve the way that or improve how we progress as a society. But if you're not actually doing a very good job of describing how things work, then you're never going to be able to change that. If please push back against that characterization. But
yeah, no, I mean, I start out, it's one of the first moves I make in the book is to go to Machiavelli. So Machiavelli is, what is he? Renaissance thinker.
Yeah, a couple hundred years later after Aquinas.
Yeah, he's after Aquinas, but well before the modern world, or, before the modern world. So in the ancient world, everybody thought politics, and to the extent that they thought about economics, they thought about it in normative terms. I mean, if you read your Aristotle, he certainly is aware of how people actually are. But they write in terms of how things should be. At least that was the Machiavellian Critique. And he's just like, if you really want to think about how to be, how to function well in this world, it just won't do to start off with some utopian idea about everybody loves each other and go from there, because everybody does not, in fact, love each other. And you're going to get a lot of you're going to get a lot of bad outcomes. And this is the economic insight par excellence, right? It's the Adam Smith idea that it's not from the love of my neighbor that my neighbor gets fed. Yep. It's out of my own self-interest, because my neighbor offers me money for the loaf of bread, and that incentivizes me to produce bread. So it's the Machiavellian Critique is, let's be pragmatic and hard-headed and realistic. And the modern project, as I understand it, in possibly a somewhat crude way. But the modern projects say, let's just assume people are self-interested, greedy bastards. And let's figure out what set of policies and institutions we can design so that we can channel their crappy behavior into good outcomes. So economists come along and say, yes, that greedy, self-interested behavior causes us to set up businesses that, are conducive to the common good because people are pursuing their profit motive. And markets just do a great job of turning that into good outcomes. And then we debate about when markets fail and that and so on. So that's the Machiavellian turn. And my frustration as an economist coming into theology is that just not enough of them understood why Machiavelli would want to make that turn. And so they do end up talking past the modern world by basically just saying, yeah, if we just got rid of private property, everything would be fine, which I think is silly. So at the same time, though, the pill that we had to swallow when we took the Machiavellian term is ratifying people as they are and saying,
right.
we go from saying people just are greedy or whatever to saying we almost slide into saying normatively that's good. It's like we might as well just pursue our best interests. That's how we are. There's no normative horizon whatsoever anymore. No idea that we could be better. Nothing to channel our interests back towards. I may well want to make things feather my own nest, but I also do care about my neighbor. And that kind of starts to get squashed out. And people actually start being shaped by that narrative. So we might actually become worse people if you live in a post-Machiavellian world that says that's how people are. So I want to...
sorry, you can finish.
No, I'm done. Go ahead.
So the thing, another really, really cool point you make is that economists, you have these two sides, right? So you call them the normative and the positive. So how things are, or how things should be, and how things are, respectively. And economists, their tools are all designed to describe how things are, right? To pass the Machiavellian critique. But then a lot of their status and social authority comes from actually really doubling down on that and saying, here's how you get more. Yeah. And so they're playing into some of the weaker urges, I guess you might say, or at the very least with perpetuating and indeed accentuating what it is about society that we're describing. And people like that, and they like having more stuff, and they like carrying on in this kind of particular value system. And so economists take a lot of, they win there because they're really good at passing the Machiavellian critique.
Yeah, no, and I think you're exactly right. The prestige of economists come because they basically give us a big thumbs up on what we're all doing.
Keep going. And here's how.
Yeah, no, exactly. But then they end up being, to my mind, a little bit pernicious. So an example of how they kind of cross this line, they come to define rationality as exactly kind of maximizing your utility subject to constraint. And they can throw in, they say, your utility can include concern for other people. But overwhelmingly, they model it as concern for yourself. And so like in a prisoner's dilemma, the prisoner's dilemma where, me pursuing my own interest and you pursuing your interest leads us jointly into a bad outcome. They call that rational. So, the reason it's a dilemma is we individually act rationally and we end up in that case in a suboptimal outcome. But if you run it in a lab test, a lot of people actually won't behave the way that model says that they're supposed to. That is, they'll actually cooperate. And it looks like that would be individually irrational. And they'll call it irrational. And of course, it's not irrational to cooperate with somebody, especially if you can see what's at stake, right? Mm-hmm. So if I can see by not cheating and that if you don't cheat, we jointly get to a better outcome, it makes a lot of sense for me to at least venture out with a white flag in the hopes that you will too, so we can jointly come to a better outcome. But economists will persist in calling that irrational. And that seems to me to skew us towards thinking, pursuing my narrow self-interest just is what is rational. And it's not a complete account of rationality. So do you see what I'm saying? It gives it a negative valence by calling it rational. You could, because, if somebody says, hey, that behavior is irrational, then I obviously don't want to do it. It's telling me what.
Yeah, rational is good because we like being rational. It means you're smart, I guess.
Yeah.
There's one kind of, I wonder what you think about this idea. There's one maybe I don't know if it's insidious or it's a little bit hidden, because one of the things that is quite amazing about the kind of the monetary system and the way that the whole kind of edifice of economic work is that the idea of being able to aggregate goods and be able to measure things is really powerful. I know in the business world where you have this saying, no doubt you're familiar with it, you manage what you measure, right? So you actually get really, because you measure stuff and it's easy to report on it and to kind of put down like a score, right? You have this, and you kind of naturally feel this inclination, in the gamification sort of world to increasing your score, so making more money, producing more GDP. And these are all things that there's going to be a kind of this moral valence, as you say, where we like having more stuff, but it's also easy to focus on it because it's there, and it's you can aggregate things by measuring how much they're worth, and I can see you falling, and this happens in the business world all the time, where you fall into the trap of a kind of working to the metric with it, losing sight of the underlying value of it, because it's always an imperfect proxy for what you want anyway. So I could see a world where everybody agrees with your critique but behaves differently anyway, only because it's easier.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it gives us a sense of control. All those numbers,
Yeah.
we know what we're doing, and we feel like we're on top of things. And sometimes that's right. Sometimes the numbers guide you to something like the truth. But yeah, very often we miss the mark. So I develop I go on to say, okay, suppose people took this perspective that Aquinas developed seriously and started thinking about happiness as pursuit of authentic goods, so that instead of chasing after this ever more, and the money metric always invites you to chase after this ever more. So I said, like, what would a firm look like if it was more oriented towards actual authentic goods? So the firm's mission would be, one, to provide goods and services for the community that are of value, right? And two, to provide a place for workers to develop their talents. And, we get a lot out of our own work, exercising our agency, cultivating our skills. That's part of what rocks as being a human, is being able to do that. It creates a community. These are all really good things. And then along the way, if the firm is functioning well, it's making a profit that allows everybody to make a living so they can go home and, pay their rent and all that stuff. And so profit is what allows them to pursue the goods that are actually worth doing. And once you start focusing on that metric of profits as a thing to be maximized, you're going to start sacrificing those other goods in important ways. And that's exactly what opens up this sort of radical left-wing rejection of markets, because people outside that system can see that a lot of human goods are being thrown under the bus in the name of profits. So
one distinction I'd like to draw, actually, we can talk a bit about this idea of rationality, because you cover it extensively in the book, and you make the point about prudence and Thomistic rationality. I think that might be the way I phrase it, but you can tell me if you think that's okay. And then there's a contrast to it as well, which is that really the idea of measuring things based on people's choices is actually itself fairly profound, right? Because you have this irrationality of rhetoric. So people say they like something, but their revealed preference in the economic jargon by the choices they actually make and the things they spend money on is often very different from what they say. And so we kind of say we live a certain way, but we really live a different way. There's an economist, Robin Hanson, who wrote a book on this, a guest on this show a little while ago, talking about the elephant in the brain, which is the hidden motivations for all the things you do. And the only real way to get a clue to what people really want is through their behaviors and actions, and talk is cheap, right? And I'm wondering if what you think about that as compared to Thomistic rationality, which you can define as well if you'd like.
No, I think the insight that people are often driven by subconscious motivations, there's definitely room for that in Aquinas' psychological, is anthropology's description of human nature. The way he put it is, and this actually lines up well with what I think Robin was probably getting at. We're rational animals. There's a significant chunk to our being that's animal in nature. So there's, and animals have a kind of quasi-rationality where they, respond to pleasures by moving towards the things that give them pleasure, and they respond to pains by moving away, and they make their calculuses pretty well on that metric or so on. And we humans, because we're animals, are often guided by our fears and our desires, much the way animals are. The difference is we have this other higher rationality that can allow us to step out and see things in the light of whether they're truly good in some more universal term. And we can make choices as a result. And sometimes we're able to cultivate the kind of self-command that allows us to make good choices. So I struggle with my weight. I'm a heavy woman. I have a lot of trouble if you put a donut in front of me. I have a lot of trouble saying no to the donut. So my animal side wins almost all the time. So I can say I believe in healthy eating, and if you looked at my choices, you go, yeah, no, you don't. You're eating the donut. And so, and Aquinas would not at all be surprised by that. He would completely expect that, because most of us fail to cultivate that higher rational self. The difference is he thinks there's space for us to do it, and oftentimes people do. People do get a certain level of self-command. People can make heroic choices, and that's definitely available. Sometimes I can actually turn down the donut, and so for Aquinas, then there's two kinds of sets of desires. There's my well-formed desires, and then there's desires that are, the rebellious animal self wanting to do its animal thing, where the animal hasn't really learned how to follow reason. And so behavioral economists are good at identifying the way the animal self works, but they're still in league with the economists as basically denying that we have the capability of cultivating a better self. And again, I don't want to say that we all should just expect to suddenly become these perfect human beings, but I really want us to leave space in our thought for the real fact that we, on the margin, always can step into those better choices, right? So
how do you reconcile that model with the Machiavellian critique, or how do you pass the Machiavellian critique with that urge to appeal to the higher rationality or to encourage it?
Yeah, basically it would be on the policymaking level, I think, where you could see it most clearly. If I go to a policymaker, I say, you really do want to listen to the economists because they have a good beat on how actual people behave. And so if you pass a policy that has, that is meant to lead us to good outcomes, but you don't take into account the fact that people might follow their own private incentives in a way that lead to unintended consequences, you're going to get bad outcomes. Like, with rent control, it seems like a good idea, but then individuals in responding to those incentives, you end up with a worse housing stock and a worse situation. So you absolutely need to listen to the economists who have a good description of how people are. But you want to try to craft your policy in a way that uses incentives reasonably and well, given the realities on the ground, in a way that leaves open space for people to do better. And so what's his name? Michael Sandal's book, What Money Can't Buy. I think that's the name of the book. He comes at it from the side of philosophy, saying, in the last 30 years, with the rise and dominance of economic way of thinking, the word incentive and incentivize is really metastasized in our culture. And once this mindset of incentivizing everything just affects everything, it gets rid of the side of the culture that tries to coax our behavior by setting social norms, by talking about what's morally desirable or admirable or good to do. And the language of incentives is crowding that out. And so you would want, you want a policymaker who can see both sides and then navigate, like, when do we go ahead and use the incentives, and when do we try to engage in, setting social norms or cultivating attitudes that conduce to better behavior. And we have classic examples of that, like with smoking. We actually defeated the bad habits people had with smoking, right, to a large extent. And some of that was taxes. Sure, we've raised the price on cigarettes really quite a lot. I used to be a smoker. But the thing that was really, really effective, the shift in the culture, was the change in social norms, right? We just got, it became more and more morally fraught to stand out smoking, thinking, well, my secondhand smoke might be killing the guy going by, right? That's not a good thing. And so, yeah. So the difference between Machiavelli and me is I just want to leave room for the other kind of encouragement towards better behavior.
Do you think that those evolution of those social norms is there a source of that? Like how deliberate or how Thomistically rational was that, or is there something else there? And the way in which I'm fascinated by that story, which of course is an extraordinary change, and there's been many such changes in society, which have genuinely, we live in a different world now from a norm standpoint than we did 50 years ago, no question, all kinds of ways. And the thing that, is there a model for that? Or is it is it simply, is it just that there are some people, individuals who really charismatic thinkers and speakers and persuaders, and then they can influence society? Or is there, some would say, well, Robin, his answer to this question was, well, as we get richer, we start to act more like rich people. So he grounds it in an economic analysis, actually. And so rich people behave certain ways, and he's got this whole framework called foragers and farmers and stuff. And people are behaving much more like they did, let's say, in the jungle, much more quality, much more security concern, weirdly. And then, but perhaps there's another model, or is it just, random acts of history where you have today's charismatic person who can influence us all?
Yeah, because I straddle both worlds, so I feel a lot of pull towards Robin's narrative. Gary Becker's got his big narrative on how did we decide to have fewer children, and there's a strong economic story you can tell about exactly why that shift happened. That's compelling to me. Nonetheless, different even once you're rich, different societies play these things out differently. It's not all economically driven. And I just, there is part of what happens with economics is we like these models that allow us to either model individual behavior or the choices of government and the impact that has. And in both cases, we're focusing on places where we can change the world by a decision that's made by one specific actor.
Sure. Yes.
And it gives us a sense of control.
Yes.
And I want to draw attention to this third space, which is culture, where I can't change. There's no button to push. There's no policy prescription that says, push this button and the culture will change its norms and attitudes. And yet clearly it does. And it does so, as you say, because some charismatic people go out and say things. Also, there could just be a groundswell. And so I kind of see my project as, my little spit in the wind where I try to share these ideas. Maybe somebody hears them. Maybe that shapes their behavior. Maybe it changes their discussion. Was it Richard Dawkins talking about memes? You can try to launch these cultural memes. And clearly some of them take hold, but nobody has control over which one wins, right? So, but that's kind of our communal project, I think, is jointly through our conversations and choices, shaping a culture that then in turn creates the space where we either can move towards better ways of being human or less good ways of being human. So.
Are we making progress from, as this, it's a big question, right? So Aquinas lived, 800 years ago or something. And he's referencing somebody who lived almost 1,000 years before him, right? Or more than, right?
Yeah.
Being Aristotle. So people have been talking about this for an awful long time. And one would imagine that the tools that you're identifying here were available to folks to make changes in their life long before, either of us were around. Mm-hmm. Do we have something more today, which gives us an advantage at actually achieving good outcomes here? Are we better off in sort of a moral sense than folks were in the Middle Ages? What do you think about moral progress?
Yeah. I don't think there's ever global moral progress because I'm enough of a Christian to think that we're kind of fallen and screwed up.
Right. It's a random walk.
Yeah. But I also think what happens is there's different spheres of morality. So I think we make progress in some. There's something to the Pinker's story about our better angels, right? The fact that people are marching in the streets today about racial injustice, and it's really widespread in the culture, represents, I think, a clear kind of progress, right? We all, I think, have ideas that it's not good to run around shooting people. It's not good. It would be really bad for us to run in and try to occupy and dominate, Canada. So that's progress. But those wins, I think, have come at the expense of other things, like
Mm.
understanding the real value of human life on other dimensions. So the medievals, I think, had a better sense about um, the fragility of human life and the need to orient yourself towards transcendent goods in order to find meaning and depth. I think, the medievals and ancients had a better idea about that.
And they lived in a remarkably more dangerous world,
Oh, yeah.
which perhaps influenced that, that focus.
Yeah, absolutely. Last fall, I ended up teaching Richard Adams' Watership Down. Did you ever read Watership Down
I have not.
growing up? It used to be a popular children's book. Um, it was about rabbits trying to find a new and safer home after their warren gets blown up, basically.
Yep.
But I think people should read it right now since we're in the process of having a world that's getting blown up. But one lesson that came out of it for me really was, and I think this is compelling, that the rabbits stumble into a warren where everybody's basically full, fat, and happy. It turns out it's a little bit pernicious. There's a farmer that's throwing out lots of carrots, lots of good rabbit food, but then every now and then just killing one or hunting, culling the crop of rabbits. But the rabbits are sitting there in their warren, and they're all full, fat, and happy. And there's no art, there's no real art, there's no real energy. They have length of life, relatively speaking, unless you're one of the unlucky rabbits that hits the wire. But there's not much there. And it resonated with Ross Douthat's critique of the decadent society, that there's something about once we hit a certain level of satisfaction that the meaning of life just sort of drains out. So anyway, our hero rabbits leave that warren and they hop off away, and they have to fight big battles, and a few of them die, but they become better, stronger versions of themselves in doing so. And yeah.
Well, there's a powerful, I guess, subplot to a lot of religious thinking, which is about through struggle and effort you find virtue,
Yeah.
And it's a little depressing, honestly, Mary, where you say in a world where we are safe and secure, we decline, and then in a world where we experience hardship and difficulty, we can rise above. Man, I mean, far be it from the politician who's so hyper aware of this to then send us off to war to better our moral selves. I mean, what can we do about this?
And I don't think it works that way. I don't think you could go out and manufacture your own suffering. Get the benefits of suffering, because by definition, suffering is dealing with circumstances beyond your control, right?
Right.
So I don't know. It may just be that as the wheels of fortune turn. I mean, I'm kind of a pessimist about how things are going right now. And if it turns out that, between the pandemic and the response to the pandemic and the already underlying civic fragility, we end up in a very long, hard decade that's something unlike, maybe more like the 1930s. Nobody wishes for that. I certainly would never push a button to go there. But the upside would be a chance to move back in towards cultivating these other kinds of human strengths. So anyway, I mean, maybe the optimistic way to say that is there's always something good going on.
Right. Yes, because we're always in a struggle. You make the point in the book as well, just to come back to that for a sec too, that there's this idea of longing, which we still have. One of the things and one of the ways in which the rational choice model and the mainstream economic thought is it does show a trail, a path, right? So you are looking for more. There's this socially constructed idea of progress that we have that you critique, pretty effectively, I think, but it's still there. So we are always looking for something, right? And I guess where does that get directed? Perhaps is the question.
No, that is exactly the question. So like in my own life, I'm trying to direct it back towards looking for wisdom, looking for depth, looking for meaning, as opposed to just looking for another raise. But yeah, we're always looking for something, and that restlessness will always be with us. And I think that's why maybe this is the mistake of modern social science projects. We want to try to engineer some kind of a utopia, and I don't think that fits human nature. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think of one of the things that I notice about maybe everybody, right, is many people are in their own way damaged, right? Mental illness is kind of maybe a more maybe a more kind of way to present it in a modernly relevant way. And I think of that manifests itself very differently for different kinds of people. You know, I've been around, seen, work with people who are extraordinarily productive individuals from like an economic standpoint, but not so not so well in other ways, and that just gets channeled in that direction. And then some folks maybe have a similar, call it encumbrance psychologically, but it just sort of spirals them out of control. You know, to me, like the freedom to kind of be your own kind of weird is also, I mean, I guess it's an important thing, but I'm not sure whether that's something that can be curtailed or should be. What do you think about that?
Yeah, the thought I had listening to you talk is just I think we want to resist trying to come up with a one size fits all model, either with respect to a diagnosis of what's wrong. So not everybody is, the one who throws, we're not all workaholics, right? We're not all throwing our whole lives under the bus in order to climb up the corporate ladder or whatever. People have different failings and different strengths. But also that to have a really good society, it's good that there would be people with different mixes and different blends and balances. So one thing I like about the Thomistic Aristotelian perspective is that a community genuinely fits together qualitatively different individuals, brings them into a relationship and draws something greater out of that whole. So if you want to work really hard in the insurance business, and that somehow is fulfilling and fitting in your life, then that's good, right? And maybe you don't have the same work-family balance that other people have, but then there's other people who maybe have the reverse balance, and society needs both, right? Because we need somebody to tend the home fires, and we need somebody to work on the front. And so maybe one way we could start to move towards is understanding that people have different gifts and respecting the way they fit together, rather than imposing this idea there's just one way to have a good, happy human life, because I think that's clearly wrong.
Yeah, and another incredible feature of the world we live in now is that another observation I've made in business is that usually most organizations exist to sort of empower a few phenomenally productive folks who have kind of more agency, in the sense that they make a lot of decisions that affect the whole organization, and the organization exists to benefit from their judgment. And those people are real hard workers. They exhibit a lot of virtues, actually. Whatever the cause of that kind of workaholism is, sometimes it's positive, not always, maybe not even usually. But the rest of society benefits in a material sense from that, because we can have these companies that produce extraordinary things, and I think as a result, sometimes it's not always a positive underneath, I guess, is my point. Yet we all kind of benefit from it. And one of the thoughts that I had in reading the book was, if your project is extremely successful at blunting that, what do we lose? And do you worry about what we might lose?
Yeah, no, and I do actually. The thing that keeps me up at night is if everybody followed my prescriptions, we would not have gotten to the modern world. We would not.
Yeah, right.
Which is, I want to retain space and say there's still room for growth, because people pursuing better ways of cultivating their land can still figure out ways to innovate. Joel Mokyr, in his book on the Industrial Revolution, points out that a lot of the great innovations did not happen out of pursuit for money or anything. They happened because gentlemen scientists like tinkering, and
yeah.
and they were really into that, and then they tinkered their way to steam engines, and here we are.
Yeah.
So you still are going to get some, but there's no doubt you don't get as much. And the question is, how can you cultivate a culture that allows for authentic, good entrepreneurial creativity, but calls that out from the kind that's bad and distracting? So
Yeah, very delicate, isn't it? I think of, let's say somebody takes an unnuanced read of your book, and thinks, oh, well, the answer is theocracy, right? So the Taliban or something, where you mandate some morally extraordinarily strict society where we live in a fallen world, right? To use your phrasing there, and as a result, we have to force people to behave in a better way. And let's just get some AK-47s and force them to live in a certain way. And I suspect you're opposed to that kind of world, but you could see how you could distort one into the other.
Yeah, no, I did have a few unfortunate readings of the book where people seemed to think I wanted a top-down driven theological model, which is not at all what I wanted. I'm still kind of more of a libertarian, not a 100% libertarian, but I like the subsidy. I like the individual agency, which again is part of why I like Aquinas on private property, because he's got that. Um, but I mean, maybe the way to put it is the emphasis on finding the good human life is a project that we have to do, right? It's not a matter of delivering good outcomes from people. And so if you really understand the thought behind what I'm talking about, the vision you just described is antithetical to what the good life really is. Because the good life is me cultivating my own understanding of the world and participating in my own development and having my own agency. And you too, right? And then we do it through conversation, and AK-47s interfere with that project rather severely. So.
Yes. How about the response to Tyler Cowen's book Stubborn Attachments, where he celebrates to be fair, he defines economic growth as what he calls economic growth plus, which includes probably related ideas to what you write about. But he still elevates this idea of compounding progress. So his is a more optimistic vision, I would guess, of one where we do something better today, and tomorrow we can build on that, and then we're that much better off, twofold. What's your reaction to his work?
Yeah, I mean, Tyler and I have been friends since graduate school, so we've been having this argument for a long, long time. And in some sense, my book was a pre-rebuttal to his book, or I don't know, maybe his book was a pre-rebuttal to mine. Anyway, I don't think he was writing in response to me, but I certainly was writing in response to him.
Well, he's extensively acknowledged in your preface, Tyler. So yeah, clearly.
So Tyler's intuition, which is a good one, is, we radically underestimate how much we've benefited from economic progress. A fact that is salient given our current situation is, we all expect to live to be 75, 85, maybe even longer. And it's just a widespread expectation. 100 years ago, as recently as 100 years ago, that just wasn't true. In the 1920 census, the top age bracket was 45 plus, right?
Wow.
Yeah, and 20% of the population lived to be 45 or older.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so on the level of length of life, quality, we don't suffer from the kinds of disabilities and stuff. If you look at old pictures, you're going to see lame kids, people with pockmarked faces.
Yep.
Literacy, the ability to travel around. I mean, we just had a lot of benefits have come from progress, and that's what he's thinking. My understanding is that's what he's thinking about. I think the mistake he makes is that he projects it out and imagines that we could keep going. And I see it more as we've approached some kind of ideal. And now that we've arrived here, what do we do to cultivate it and deepen it rather than think about extending it more? And the life issue is the clearest one. I don't think we gain anything by trying, first of all, there's a natural lifespan that I think would be very hard for us to get past. But you have to start off with the fact that we're mortal. And now that we've achieved kind of that most people hit the natural lifespan rather than dying prematurely, what does it mean then to live well, which is different from living longer? And the same is true about wealth. I mean, we no longer starve to death. We have all our basic needs met. So what does it mean to live well now that we've achieved this? And it's a different question from the more that he's got. So
it is, and it's fascinating to me in reading and thinking about this, and interviewing Tyler as well and others on these related topics, is that I come back to this kind of measurement problem where it seems to me, there's a happiness literature, right, which is I don't know, not all that satisfying really, because it surveys and the like. There isn't really kind of, if we could only measure and aggregate happiness, then we probably would be a heck of a lot better at figuring it out. I mean, one might suspect that that social media on net improves happiness. I mean, that'd be. I mean, you don't necessarily want to spark that debate here, but it's a possibility. And maybe there's technology which doesn't turn up in the GDP stats and doesn't turn up in any other stats, but which we clearly are expressing a preference for. And even if you took the most positive interpretation of that, where let's just assume that there's something which is a miracle technology that we could invent that would implement your vision for genuine genuine progress of human flourishing, we wouldn't know. I mean, you would have an opinion, and I would have an opinion, and maybe not everybody. People just disagree with each other for no particular good reason sometimes. But we wouldn't have a way of proving that we've actually made some kind of progress on this question.
Yeah, yeah. And this effort to measure and pin it down, the question of what is really a good life and what's a fulfilling life, seems to me that part of what is a good and fulfilling life is precisely asking the question of what is a good and fulfilling life.
Good point.
So, again, my social science colleagues, my former colleagues in the economics world, they teach us important things, but we put them to the summit of human knowledge. And I just kind of would like us to go back to a world where, cool, I've learned from what you have to say, but I still want to really think through for myself. Social media does these good things, but how does that really conduce to human flourishing? I see it's missing this. And then my friend David says, no, but you're not seeing that. And I go, oh, well, that's interesting. And then we just have this back and forth and we learn something. And it's fun, especially if
it is
like fighting each other to the death over it.
Yeah. Hasn't happened yet in this conversation. I think we might get away without it. I wonder so here's like something of a misgiving I have about this kind of this entire project and your project, if I could put it this way, is that I feel like people do this all the time. I mean, I'm constantly having conversations with folks about kind of how do you get better. People have the frustrations with the world. I think that your view is actually really broadly held, and to me, it feels like there's a lack of a kind of satisfying way to actually make progress on that. And then as individuals and as adults, you learn about the world, and when you're a kid, you think the world's a certain way, and then you get older and you learn and get better, right? So I think that where we are making progress on this as individuals, if not as a society. So look at the self-help literature. I mean, what is that if not a cry for help, or for a way for people to kind of pursue this on their own? And so I suppose the question would be, what would you change about that, or what would your change look like, do you think, in terms of actual behavior for folks on the ground?
Yeah, no, I mean, I did worry about this. I'm like, who doesn't already know this? I always worry about that. And there's just tons of great literature out there, people exploring it. I mean, we had the whole simplicity movement in the 80s and 90s where people wanted to go back to finding more meaningful lives with less stress and hectic and stuff. I see my contribution mostly as speaking to economists and theologians, because they very often just don't see that. I mean, maybe a way to put it is, you're saying the culture is already moving in the directions or already has a lot of what I'm talking about in it. And I want to bring our intellectual apparatus more into alignment with that.
Interesting.
Because it is still true. I mean, almost lots and lots and lots of people take Econ 101, which means they learn that rationality just does mean maximizing under constraint. And almost all of our policy discussions get put into that framework, and it's distorting. And so even though people have these good ideas, they don't have an intellectual apparatus that allows them to live it out as fully as they might. So that's what I see the contribution as being. A quick example in our endless, not very fruitful debates over this lockdown response to the virus. Is it health? Do we care about lives on the one side, or, the economy on the other? And people want to construe that as, longer lives versus more money. And in both cases, we want to maximize. You see that? So it makes it hard about how it fits together. And in both cases, we're not thinking about what are the authentic goods that are served, like, what actually makes life worth living, and what actually are the human goods and the things that come from the economy. And so even though I think I agree with what you said, I look at the way the discourse goes, and I think I still need to write my book, because people still are talking in terms of these instrumental goods without really thinking about the real goods that actually make life worth living.
Yeah, I love that framing, actually, and I think I have lost my job. So the hardship in my family is, I mean, it's constrained to my wife who stays home with her kids. We just had a baby, which is our fourth. And so they're all 7 and under. And so it's just like pretty nuts in the house, which, but when we look at that, we think to ourselves, okay, there's some hardship here. The kids, at the homeschool, we have to figure out all that, which is, man, that's difficult. But I should probably point out, we're recording this on June 9th. So we have the timestamp when we start talking about coronavirus. And but at the same time, we talk about, boy, isn't it cool that we get to spend all this time with each other, and we love it, right? And so that's it. It seems to me that what really I found interesting about your comment there was, in some ways, it's like a battle cry against the elites in a certain sort of way, because the elites adopt an agenda of some sort, which is maybe rooted in it's rooted in some version of reality, right? But it's kind of hard for them to grasp at a model that kind of captures enough nuance to you have the soundbite world, and you kind of have to adopt the position, and the position, what is your authority, and then that comes back to your academic credentials, which is what you published your model on. And if there's a bias in all that apparatus, then like the conversation will get influenced. And maybe that's been a huge frustration for our society as well, perhaps, that we're missing a lot of what you're saying and talking about.
Yeah. No, I have a rule of thumb that says when a debate is polarized, it's because an underlying premise that is shared by both sides is not an adequate underlying premise.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. So, and I think that's what's going on with this particular debate. So,
how successful would you say you've looking back at your book? What do you want to do next? What's the urge that this has created in you? Do you feel like you got it where you want it to be? What's your kind of reflection on the process and where you're at?
yeah. So I'm 59. It took me a long time to write my first book. So, I'm not the most productive scholar who ever lived. So this is the book was wonderful to me to write, because it was just sort of the culmination of a long and complicated intellectual journey, and it actually received more attention than I expected. So it wasn't a blockbuster or anything, but so that was all really good. The difficulty for me is I really am a committed Christian and Catholic, and I really think that it's important to think about life as oriented towards God, which is not, and the irony of my life is that I have to spend my life as an economist turned theologian talking about economics, which I think is a order concern, right? And I get all this, whatever attention I do get is because people think it's cool to talk about economics, and the real lesson of the book is, but no, God matters more, right? You see that tension. So I'm not quite sure. I could, there's a world where I could pursue this and, write articles amplifying on it. I've done some of that. And I spend time at workshops and trying to share this vision with up and coming economists and create space for them to grow into this sort of way of thinking. But I kind of would rather think more about spirit. I would rather turn back more to pure theology at this point. I'm not sure. So I've been sitting here on this fence, and what happened after the book came out is I got flooded with a lot of invitations to talk and papers to write. So I've just kind of been working on the stuff that comes up to do. But in terms of the next big project, I'm not sure. It'll either be a book about my conversion story, or it'll be a book about feminism and household economics and the good life. So I'm not sure which one.
Well, it does feel to me like there is a lot of ground to synthesizing, I think, a lot of the value that comes from the theology of the Christian thinking, and a lot of the rest of the world, which doesn't necessarily kind of doesn't want to study that directly, right? Yeah. I think that your book was a fantastic contribution, and I would encourage other folks to read it, to buy it and read it. Where can we get your book, Mary?
Sometimes on Amazon. So
yes.
Sometimes they run out, but I think they've got some now. So yeah, Harvard University Press, you can always go to their website. And I think your independent bookstores tend to have it. So give them a shout. Do small business. That's a good thing to do.
Yes. My guest today is Mary Hirschfeld. Mary, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.